IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat. Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. I'm Manoj Kewalramani, and today I have with me my colleague Rohan Seth, and we're going to be talking about all things technology. We're going to be talking about the WWDC conference that's taken place recently, a little bit about the kind of products that we've seen, and also about new steps that are being taken and the new controversy around privacy, specifically with regard to China. But before we get on to the conversation, let me just tell you that All Things Policy is brought to you, supported by Pragati. You can visit the website thinkpragati.com for more. Rohan, welcome to the conversation.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Rohan, let's first begin with this WWDC conference. Like, you track tech, I don't track tech really that much. Tell me what's exactly happened at this conference.
So the Worldwide Developers Conference, it used to be a really sort of quaint sort of a thing, if you can believe it. So Apple used to hold an event where they would update their sort of platforms and developers would come in and talk to engineers about how things would work on the new platforms and so on. As time has progressed, this has moved on and become like a whole huge event where developers around the world tune in. I think they spent millions of dollars hosting this, and it's done really tastefully, really well. You can look at the video on YouTube and the Apple website, I imagine. But the main thing is this is a software event, so you get updates to the iPhone ecosystem, the iPad ecosystem, the Mac ecosystem, and so on. I was actually thinking this recently, and I think it's really funny the amount of work that Apple just seems to get through in a year. So, like, I was thinking that we generally at Takshashila, the workload, we feel like we're working a lot. And Apple, on the other hand, has to churn out a new iPhone every year, has to churn out a new iPad every year, a new laptop once in a while, maintain services, and then has to update the App Store and has to update the iOS. There's a whole new iPad App Store. They have to update the iPad OS. The Mac OS has to be updated. There's also an App Store in Messages that needs to be taken care of. So it's just a whole sort of host of platforms that are organized and maintained by Apple. And WWDC basically is the event that looks at the software of it.
Yeah, but that's, before we sort of get ahead, being very happy about Apple, my views, how disgruntled I have been with some of the products recently. So, fresh coat of paint on things is not necessarily always very useful from a consumer's point of view. And I'm just going to leave it at that rather than the company getting annoyed at me. But okay, from what I understand, there was also one of the sort of key themes also this year was there was lots of new softwares, new sort of tools with regard to privacy. That was a theme. So I was reading through some of the news reports after the conference, and all of them talked about these 7-8 new different privacy focused features that have been announced. Do you have a sense of what are these things, and why is Apple once again sort of putting privacy at the forefront? Does it also reflect something about what Apple's consumers tend to believe? Because increasingly, I would assume that effectiveness, efficiency would be far more significant. But does it tell us a little, can we sort of draw that inference saying that consumers are becoming far more privacy driven in terms of their product choices? Or is this just Apple saying we're adding these new layers because these are values that we believe?
This question's a bit of a curveball. I'll tell you why. There's two layers to this. On a business sense, on the business side of things, if Apple says that we are pro privacy, it does two things. It puts Apple in a good place and it puts its competition in a really bad place. So Apple can essentially differentiate itself from other big tech, such as Facebook, such as Google, and say that we are the ones who actually care about your data. Of course, Facebook and Google have not covered themselves in glory as far as consumer data is concerned, but I think it's more of a strategic move. This is not to say that Apple doesn't value privacy. I think it does. I think it has made significant leaps as far as privacy is concerned. Also, I've read the book on Tim Cook. There's a reading list that I maintain. But in the book on Tim Cook, it really goes into detail about Apple's fundamental values and why privacy is so important to them. But more broadly, I think it's a good business move to have, because essentially, I think the message here is that if you are an Apple user, your data is safe and you pay a little more money, that's fine. But it's sort of like you value your information. On the flip side of things, if you're an Android user, there's every chance that your data may be subject to more risk and you might be targeted a lot more than if you were on the other side of the device. Which also sort of, okay, this is a bit of a jump, but this also means that people are more locked into the Apple ecosystem if they want more privacy. And what this means, and I think we can get into this later, is that once you're in the Apple ecosystem, Apple is the absolute toll booth that, if not you, I mean, you do have to pay them, but developers themselves have to pay a lot. And it's a better environment, but it comes at a cost. And I think it's a cost that Apple's really, really proud of. On the flip side of things, which is that are consumers getting more privacy conscious? I don't know. It's hard to say. And that's why I think it's a curveball because people in our demographic, specifically maybe even more so in my demographic, because I work on tech a lot more, I would say that I do care about what happens to my data. And so that way I am more conscious of just how private my information is. I don't think people, at least in India, the most demographics, and this is just a hunch, don't usually care about privacy as much if they can get a phone for a reduced price. So I don't think that people who are buying low to mid range smartphones are thinking about privacy. I think it's a trade off they're happy to make. So yeah, makes strategic sense for Apple. Makes I'm not sure if this applies to consumers worldwide uniformly.
This privacy argument is sort of interesting, and it's interesting that you talk about how Apple sort of positioning itself in a certain way vis-a-vis its competitors. But at the same time, there is increasing reportage about Apple sort of compromising some of these values of privacy and this claim to privacy to operate in the Chinese market. Now, the Chinese market is obviously critical to Apple's growth. It's one of the biggest markets where Apple enjoys its presence. And we've seen in the last couple of months, there's been reportage about how certain compromises have been made. So there was that New York Times report about, Apple storing data from its Chinese consumers on servers owned by a Chinese state-owned company. This came after the 2017 law that was passed in China, or security law that was passed, which sort of required, essentially mandated localization of data. And again, the idea that this will make it much more easy for the Chinese state to access this data was something that wasn't really a matter of concern for Apple. And there's also this other, and remember we were talking about this just before we started recording, about a new feature that's been launched by Apple. I can't remember the name, a privacy feature, Cloud Keychain or something like that. You can clearly see that I'm not an Apple user. Uh, and that again is something that they're not offering in China. How does this organization reconcile this values argument at one end outside of China and completely a different approach inside of China to access that market?
Okay, so few things. I think so. The feature itself that you're talking about is called iCloud Relay. It's I think one step short of a VPN. I'm a bit hazy on the technical details of how it works, so maybe we can put a link in the show notes as to how that operates. But the broad idea is that it makes browsing the internet a more secure place for Apple consumers. Of course, this is a part of iCloud Plus because everything just needs a plus now. So and it's I think as an Apple consumer and on the other side of this conversation, I am quite happy that iCloud's being updated because. And before I get into the China bit, I think it's important to talk about dark patterns because I feel like as someone who owns an iPhone and an Apple computer and a tablet, the the thing here is that if I click more than two photos, I will run out of iCloud storage. They give you 5 gigabytes of storage, and because photos have become better, they've become bigger. It and iCloud Drive, if you back up your WhatsApp chats and so on, like 5 gigabytes runs out like that. Uh, and I think this is a very, very powerful nudge for people to upgrade to iCloud. I say it's powerful because I was nudged into doing this myself. Uh, this sort of brings me to this subscription thing. I think it with this feature, it's harder for me to leave the iCloud sort of at least paying for iCloud, and and I think it's very in line with how Apple's been positioning itself. With the China conundrum, I would add that. they haven't offered this in China plus 9 other countries, if I'm not wrong. It's a developing story, so I'm sure we might hear more about this and how it might be implemented in India and so on. I'm not sure. I don't want to speculate here, but I think the broad argument here is that Apple follows the country it operates in, follows the law of the country it operates in. I'm going to say this in the loosest possible way, but I think there's also a business interest because how big of a market China is for Apple. It has made other compromises there as well. So, for example, Chinese employees have previously complained, and if they've complained against the designed by Apple in California tag that used to be behind iPhones and AirPods and so on. And now the design by Apple in California tag is not a part of products that are sold by Apple in China. Apple has also sort of blocked tools for organizing pro-democracy protests and skirting internet restrictions, and has also blocked apps about the Dalai Lama. And it's just a recurring theme. I think there's also a lot of debate in how iCloud operates in China because the keys to encryption, and this is speculation, I think, are also shared with the Chinese state. And so it makes the user privacy of Apple consumers vulnerable. It's not pattern that we have seen elsewhere. And I think this is sort of a good segue for me to talk about business interests and values because I was reading the book on Twitter, Hatching Twitter, I think it's called. And I think at one point in the book, there is a part that talks about a revolution in Iran. And and Twitter employees have decided that Twitter will go down for maintenance at a specific time. And that would mean that Twitter will also be down in Iran for that time. That would mean, and this is really fascinating, but this would have meant that the revolution would be impacted by Twitter maintenance hours. Now, Twitter has two choices. It can either say that actually we're going to go ahead with this because we don't want to have anything to do with the revolution, or the other stance that they can take is to say that actually we don't want to be the ones to have an impact on the revolution, so Twitter will stay up and we will reschedule maintenance to a time that is less inconvenient. Now, regardless of what Twitter does, it is a situation that is going to have an implicit value judgment placed on it, right? And this sort of also applies to Apple in a lot of situations. So if you think about Hong Kong and the protests that were happening there, you and I, of course, wrote a paper on this. And we looked at how Apple was actually removing apps to tell people where the police were and so on, right? So the fact that Apple has to make these judgments that may or may not be ethical depending on what side you're on. I mean, I think I don't want to personally weigh on this, but I feel like this is not just a value judgment for Apple anymore on how it wants to operate iCloud in China. I think this is now very much a business judgment where they have realized that if they are to play in the Chinese market, they are going to have to play by the rules. And you will see this systematically playing out from the past 4 to 5 years. And it's a line that you can draw straight through this company's actions.
Right.
I think you have a better.
I want to interrupt you there. This argument of it being a business decision and it not being a value based judgment. So while it's completely fair and sort of the rational sort of sense in me tells me that yes, of course, it's an organization, it's a corporation, its job is to maximize profits for its shareholders. And if it's doing that, it's doing that. Yet there is something about technology firms, particularly operating in an environment where this is not just about device usage. This is about today we're living our lives online, and this is not just about a product that you're using. This is a product that is shaping the way we behave, shaping how we act. The fact that we are online and we are having a conversation make has it sort of in itself impacts how we have that conversation, as opposed to if you and I were to have it face to face. And that's what we see on, say, social media when we see angry tweets and anonymous threats and all of that. So the medium is influencing how people behave. It's influencing things that we value, and it's influencing also how we are governed, how we are monitored. And that then again sort of defines the boundaries of our individual space and freedom, our ability to influence the state, and so on and so forth. So it can't just be a business decision for any firm, because it's an easy cop out for any firm to say that, look, this is my dharma is maximizing revenue and profit, and that's what I need to do. Because the products that you're creating, the services that you're providing are linked to these broader effects, which are beyond, which are essentially changing the nature of society. And in that context, a company can't sort of, and we've seen tech companies, whether it's Apple, whether it is Twitter, whether it is Facebook. We've seen these companies recognize this in when they speak publicly, and we've also seen them stand up and make the value-based arguments in certain markets, whether it is in India, where encryption and privacy is a value-based argument that's being made. It's also a business argument that's been made by WhatsApp, but that's one part of the argument. At the same time, in the US, with Apple particularly, we saw that entire controversy around the unlocking of the phone of, I believe, it was the San Bernardino attack, when we saw that entire controversy. To be able to make those arguments in these societies, yet to go to China and to say, we are not going to make the privacy argument, or we are going to make the privacy argument based on how the government wants us to make it, because, for example, in the Chinese market, it's not like the consumers are not concerned about privacy. Of course, they are concerned about privacy. People have taken Chinese tech firms to court over privacy. Biggest Chinese tech majors have had to apologize for privacy policies and sort of automatic collection of data. And in the last couple of months, we've seen so many different apps being cracked down on by the government because of privacy violations. You've got a personal data law in China, which is being discussed. You've got a new data security law, which was just passed this week. So these companies are being complicit in the regulatory environment that is being shaped in China, which essentially sets standards and values which will be exported, because that's the kind of regulatory environment that others may also sort of adopt if they want to adopt that sort of governance model of state control over technology, state control over people's data and people's behavior. And I think therefore these companies need to make that value-based argument. That's the point that I was trying to make.
I don't know if I completely agree or disagree. Mostly because I have never been put in.
I think I've achieved my target. I've left you stumped, which is
No, let me respond to that with a story,
yeah.
which is again a book on Google written by Stephen Levy, the former editor-in-chief of Wired, and I think it's called In the Plex. Now, as we all know, Google has has left China a while ago. I'm not sure what year that was, and of course, you and I both know China uses Baidu as a search engine. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. But the main idea, and people actually say this, they quote this, I think, in part wrongly, sorry, incorrectly, is that Google left China because of the values argument, because Google has a holier than thou approach to things, because their whole motto for the longest time was "Don't be evil." Of course, that holier than thou attitude also applies to Apple. They are a company that sort of does claim that they are very focused on user privacy and so on. And the reason Google left China wasn't because things weren't sitting well with its values. I don't think it was as simple. It was because they weren't doing well, and they weren't able to culturally adapt. Their employees were in China were not able to adapt to the Silicon Valley values that they brought along with themselves. And the broader point I'm trying to make here is that did not actually stop Google from trying to experiment in China. They basically said that search won't be in China, and I think the term was everything but search will be part of. And they also experimented with a thing called Project Dragonfly, which was to have a censored web for the Chinese. So yes, values do play a part. Are they the deciding factor for tech companies? I highly doubt it. Should they be the deciding factor for tech companies? It's a question I don't think I am equipped to answer. But going back to what Apple is doing in China, if I was in that environment, and thankfully I am not, as a user, I would feel really, really powerless. And so that's where I'm at right now. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a point well made. I mean, I just want to sort of add to the comments that you made about Google's exit from China. So Google exited China in 2010, and this was after sort of obviously a difficult period. Part of it is fair. I think the criticism that you made about its inability to compete, and I think Kai-Fu Lee in his book also makes this point. And I think that's part of the story, of course, but part of the story is also about the environment becoming difficult with censorship and also cyber attacks targeting Google because of censorship related issues. And I think that sort of led to a huge problem, because Google found that Gmail accounts of number of Chinese activists, human rights activists, had been hacked, and it eventually decided that look. users are using Google because they believe in they assume certain amount of security, and if that's being undermined, then it's a problem. So I think there was a cascading set of problems which had to do with values and the business environment, but also Google's sort of failure to be able to adapt to how the Chinese market is changing. There's a bunch of different things, so we can't sort of put it to one thing. I mean, my point of the values thing was, I don't think values would be the only thing that should be driving. Of course, profit considerations and the rest of it will be a critical component of it. But in an environment where we know how application of technology and governance of technology will shape how we do business, how we engage, how we speak to each other, what we are able to say, what we are not able to say, and eventually even moderate our thinking because of the nature of how we engage, because the public sphere is becoming online. It's really important for these companies, and that he will end up developing the sense of that there'll be an altruistic, value-based driver for the individual. I mean, I'm not saying that, but I think at the end of the day, it's important for tech companies to also realize that the environment and the governance model that they end up facilitating will also eventually end up biting their business. And if that's a driving factor for them to prioritize certain values over others, and certain values which are freedom, privacy, and privacy in terms of even state, due process when you need access to certain kinds of data, and the due process needs to be genuine due process, then I think it's important for that argument to be made to these guys that this is in your interest in the long term, even in your financial interest in the long term. So I think that is where the sort of point was.
I would just like to add that I hope these companies think about these issues deeply. But I also think that the environment that they operate in different countries can be constraining. I'm not making an excuse for Apple as much as just saying that maybe it's not Apple, maybe it's China, is sort of the gist that I'm trying to hint at. Not least because, and I think you know this better than I do, but I don't think the Chinese are the most compromising people when it comes to tech. At least my experience on reading about stuff with Jack Ma and so on has told me that the party at least does not take lightly to non-compliance.
Yeah, I mean, of course, and I don't think any state that wants to will sort of end up doing this, and that's what we see, right, in this whole conversation about tech companies having greater power and dictating to states. And we've seen this entire argument in India also. And that's why I think that it's important, that there is a certain degree of consistency in what companies also end up doing. You can't make that freedom values argument in India and say that in China that argument does not work, so we're not going to make it. I think it's important that companies also develop a certain amount of consistency to be able to do that. But maybe I'm just being an idealistic person, so rare moments where I have idealism.
I think on that note, I think it's safe to sort of leave it there and end while we're on an optimistic note.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you so much, all of you, for listening to this conversation, and do keep tuned in to All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsor on the network this week, Credencia. Thank you so much for making this possible. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus was joined by actress Shreya Pilgaonkar to talk about her career in acting. On Begin the Journey, Ashish Vidyarthi lists down the modern concepts of friendship and how one can choose the right friend circle in life on Begin the Journey. On The Habit Coach, Ashton Doctor was joined by Aisha Bilamoria to talk about running and developing an athletic mentality. Farhad and Sunethra are joined by LGBTQ workplace advocate Suresh Ramdas to discuss the new normal in queer relationships on KBCD. On Tere Mere Raste, Keshav Chaturvedi takes us to the riverbanks of Banaras and describes the soulful mornings to us. And finally, on the Positively Unlimited podcast, Chetna Chakravarti takes the fear out of the word responsibility. And with that, I hope to see you again next week.
2020 is a difficult year. A global pandemic, protests, elections, recessions. You get the picture. What we need is a space where we can have nuanced discussions about global affairs and foreign policy. That's where I come in. My name is Hamsini Hariharan and I host the States of Anarchy podcast. Every second Tuesday, I speak to experts in the field of international relations to make a little more sense of the world. So join me on the IVM podcast app, website, or wherever you're listening to me right now.